$10? For that dump? A man laughed from the back of the county auction room. Nobody else even looked up. Ethan Walker, 42, former Army medic, stood with rain on his jacket and a German Shepherd at his side. The clerk cleared her throat. Whitaker Lanes, minimum bid $10. Ranger rose before Ethan did. His eyes locked on the faded photo of the bowling alley. Ethan whispered, "What do you see, boy?" The dog pressed one paw against his boot. Ethan raised his hand. Everyone thought he bought a ruin. Ranger knew he had just bought a secret. Ethan Walker had $42 in his wallet, half a tank of gas, and a German Shepherd in the passenger seat who understood silence better than most people understood words. The dog's name was Ranger, though Ethan rarely used it unless he had to. Most days a look was enough, a lift of the chin, 2 fingers against the steering wheel, a quiet tap on his knee when the world got too loud inside his chest. They had been driving west across Ohio since sunrise, not because Ethan had somewhere to be, but because motion had become easier than explaining why he never stayed anywhere long. Rain dragged thin gray lines down the windshield. Cornfields blurred into feed stores, church steeples, closed gas stations, and towns with names painted on water towers, as if that alone could keep them from being forgotten. Cedar Hollow appeared just after 3 in the afternoon, tucked between low hills and a 2-lane road that looked tired of carrying people through. Ethan stopped for coffee because the truck needed fuel and his hands needed something warm to hold. The diner was called Louise's, though the sign had lost 2 bulbs and made the name look like a question. Inside, men in work jackets spoke softly over pie. A waitress refilled cups without asking, and nobody looked long at Ethan except Ranger, who watched him from the truck through the window, ears high, eyes steady, as if keeping count of every breath. Ethan paid with exact change, left 2 quarters under the mug, and stepped back into the rain. That was when he saw the notice board outside the old brick town hall across the street. Most of the papers were curled from weather. A volunteer cleanup, a church supper, a farm equipment auction, a missing barn cat named Pearl. At the bottom, held by one rusted thumbtack, was a pale yellow sheet stamped Canty Tax lien sale. Ethan would have walked past it. He had spent years learning not to reach for things that did not belong to him. But Ranger made a sound from the truck, not a bark, not a whine, something low and questioning. Ethan turned. The dog stood rigid behind the glass, nose pointed at the board. "What?" Ethan murmured. Ranger struck the window once with his paw. Ethan crossed the street and leaned closer. There were 7 properties listed. Empty lots, a burned-out service garage, a house with foundation damage, and at the very bottom, Whitaker Lanes, Route 22. Minimum bid, $10. For reasons Ethan could not name, his eyes stayed there. Maybe it was the price, small enough to feel like a dare. Maybe it was the faded photograph stapled beside the listing. An old bowling alley with a red neon sign, 12 lanes, and a parking lot full of cars from another decade. Or maybe it was Ranger, who had gone still in the truck, watching the paper as if it had called him by name. The sale was happening in 15 minutes inside the town hall. Ethan stood in the rain long enough for cold water to slide beneath his collar. A sensible man would have left. A man with $42 would not spend 10 on a dead building with a leaking roof and back taxes tangled around it like vines. But Ethan had not felt sensible in a long time. He had felt useful once overseas and later in field clinics, where his hands knew what to do before his mind could catch up. Since coming home, usefulness had become harder to locate. People thanked him for his service, then grew uncomfortable when he did not know how to answer. Employers liked the discipline until they saw the nights he did not sleep. Friends invited him once, twice, then stopped making him choose. Only Ranger stayed close without asking him to become easier to love. Ethan went inside. The auction room smelled of old paper, wet coats, and burned coffee. A county clerk read property names in a voice worn smooth by repetition. Nobody bid on the garage. Nobody bid on the lots. When she reached Whitaker Lanes, a man in the back gave a soft laugh. The kind people use when something is too ruined to deserve pity. "Minimum bid $10, the clerk said. Silence settled. Ethan felt Ranger's leash warm against his palm, though the dog was sitting calmly at his heel. He looked down. Ranger looked up, not pleading, not commanding, just certain. Ethan raised his hand. The clerk blinked. $10? Yes, Mom, Ethan said. His voice sounded strange in the room, as if it had traveled from far away. Any other bids? No one moved. Outside, Rain tapped the tall windows with patient fingers. "Sold," the clerk said. Just like that, for $10 and a signature that came out shakier than he wanted, Ethan Walker became the owner of Whitaker Lanes, a shuttered bowling alley on Route 22 that Cedar Hollow had spent 22 years pretending not to see. He drove there before dusk. The building sat beyond a cracked parking lot, long and low beneath a sky the color of wet ash. The red sign was dead. One letter hung crooked. Weeds pushed through the asphalt. Ranger jumped down first and walked straight to the locked front doors. Ethan followed, key in hand, heart quieter than it had been all day, and heavier in a way he did not understand. The door opened with a tired groan. Inside, darkness waited. Ranger stepped forward, paused, and turned back once, as if to make sure Ethan was coming too. Ethan did not step fully into Whitaker Lanes at first. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and the other wrapped around Ranger's leash, letting the stale air come to him in slow layers. Old wood, damp ceiling tile, dust, machine oil, and something faintly sweet beneath it all, like spilled soda that had dried 20 years ago and refused to leave. Ranger moved ahead 3 steps, then stopped, waiting. That was what the dog always did. He never dragged Ethan into a room. He only went far enough to prove the room could be entered. Ethan had learned that kind of patience from him, though not quickly. Back when the Army hospital first paired them, Ranger had been 5 years old, broad-chested and watchful, with a scarless face and eyes that seemed older than the man holding the leash. Ethan had laughed then, a short humorless sound, and told the therapist he did not need a dog. He needed work, a schedule, a place where his hands could be useful again. The therapist, a woman with silver hair and the calm of someone who had heard every version of no, said, "Maybe he is the schedule." Ethan had not answered. At 37, he had already come home with a body that looked mostly intact, and a life that had quietly emptied itself, while everyone congratulated him on surviving. People liked clean endings. They liked ceremonies, folded flags, handshake lines, barbecue fundraisers with banners that said "Welcome home." Ethan had stood through all of it in pressed shirts, nodding at the right times, smiling when somebody held up a phone for a picture. But at night, in the small apartment outside Dayton, he sat on the edge of the bed until dawn, with his boots lined beside the door, unable to explain why silence felt less like peace than a warning. He had been an Army medic, which meant strangers had trusted his hands before they knew his name. He had carried bandages in every pocket. He had known how to read a pulse in the dark, how to speak softly when fear filled a room, how to make his voice sound certain even when certainty was the one thing he did not have. For years, that had been enough. There was a need, and he answered it. There was pain, and he moved toward it. Then he came home, and pain stopped announcing itself clearly. It hid in unopened mail, missed phone calls, unpaid parking tickets, a refrigerator light shining on nothing but mustard and bottled water. His fiancée, Nora, tried longer than most people would have. She learned not to touch his shoulder from behind. She bought blackout curtains. She left notes on the counter because spoken questions made him feel cornered before he knew why. But love, even patient love, can get tired of standing outside a locked door. One November morning, Ethan found her engagement ring beside the coffee maker, placed gently on a folded towel like something breakable. The note beneath it said only, "I hope you find your way back to yourself." He had kept the towel. He did not know why. After that, he drifted through work the way some men drift through weather. A warehouse job, night security at a medical supply company, maintenance at a roadside motel where nobody asked much because everybody passing through looked temporary. He was good at fixing things: hinges, pipes, loose wires, stubborn locks. People appreciated the result, not the man. That suited him until it didn't. Ranger changed nothing at first. The dog simply existed beside him with a steadiness that made excuses difficult. At 6 in the morning, Ranger needed to go out. At 6 in the evening, he needed food. When Ethan forgot to breathe evenly, Ranger put one heavy paw on his knee and held it there until the shaking inside him softened into something human. No speech, no pity, no advice, just weight, warmth, presence. Over time, Ethan began to understand that Ranger was not there to save him in some bright, dramatic way. He was there to keep him company, while Ethan did the slower work himself. Now, inside the dead bowling alley, that same paw pressed lightly against Ethan's boot. He looked down. Ranger's ears were forward, his body alert, but there was no fear in him, only recognition. Ethan took one breath, then another, and stepped across the threshold. Behind him, rain whispered over the parking lot. Ahead, 12 dark lanes stretched into shadow, polished once, forgotten now. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the strange pull of a place that did not ask him to explain his damage before letting him in. The first thing Ethan noticed was that Whitaker Lanes had not gone quiet all at once. It had faded in layers. The front counter still held a plastic cup full of golf pencils, their erasers hardened into pink stone. A rental shoe rack stood against the wall with numbers taped above each cubby, though most of the shoes were gone and the few that remained had curled at the toes from age. Behind the snack bar, paper menus yellowed beneath a sheet of dust, advertising hot dogs for $2, coffee for 75 cents, and something called Maggie's Friday Night Chili. The ceiling had sagged in 3 places where rainwater had found its way through the roof. One tile had fallen completely, leaving a dark square above Lane 3 like an eye that had opened and never closed. Ethan moved slowly, not out of fear but respect. Some rooms felt empty. This one felt interrupted. Ranger walked beside him, paws soundless on the worn carpet. He sniffed the base of the counter, the legs of old stools, the place where the arcade machines had once stood, leaving only pale rectangles on the wall. At the far end, the lanes stretched into the dimness, 12 long ribbons of maple and pine, dulled but still faintly beautiful beneath the grime. Ethan imagined the place with light in it, shoes sliding, pins cracking, someone laughing too loudly after a lucky spare, a woman behind the counter calling out names before anyone reached the desk. It surprised him how clearly the building offered its ghosts without asking permission. He had been in abandoned places before, motels, depots, storage units, foreclosed houses with mail still scattered under the slot. Most of them carried the same smell of surrender. Whitaker Lanes was different. It did not feel surrendered. It felt as though everyone had stepped outside for a storm and somehow forgotten to come back. Ranger stopped at Lane 1, lowered his nose, then moved on. Lane 2 earned a brief sniff, Lane 3 nothing. Lane 4, he paused at an old water stain, sneezed once, and continued. Ethan followed, one hand brushing the scoring tables as he passed. The plastic seats were split along the edges. Someone had carved LW plus DM into the side of a console. Near Lane 6, a bowling ball the color of dark green glass rested in the return track, as if waiting for a hand that had aged elsewhere. "You finding something, boy?" Ethan asked quietly. Ranger did not look back. At Lane 7, the dog stopped so suddenly that Ethan nearly stepped into him. His body changed first, not tense exactly, focused. His ears came forward, his tail lowered but did not tuck, and one front paw lifted, hovered, then settled gently onto a warped strip of wood near the foul line. Ethan stood still. Rain ticked somewhere in the ceiling. A loose sign clicked against the front window each time the wind found it. Ranger lowered his head and breathed along the seam where the lane had buckled. Then he gave one soft sound from deep in his chest, the kind Ethan had learned to trust because Ranger never wasted it. Ethan crouched. The boards at Lane 7 had risen unevenly, not from simple rot. The split ran almost straight, too clean in places, then jagged where age had worked at it. He took out his flashlight and angled the beam into the opening. Beneath the wood was concrete, but not like the rest of the slab. This patch was smoother, lighter, poured in a rectangle that measured roughly 4 feet by 3. The edges had been feathered carefully, then hidden under the lane. Ethan laid his palm flat against it. Cold moved into his skin. The whole building was cold, but this was different, a deep, steady chill, the kind metal holds after a long night. He shifted his hand to the surrounding concrete. Warmer, back to the rectangle, cold again. Ranger watched him with amber eyes steady as lamplight. "Somebody put something here," Ethan said. Saying it aloud made the room feel smaller, not dangerous. Not exactly. More intimate, as if he had accidentally spoken a family secret in front of the dead. He sat back on his heels and looked down the long abandoned lane. The number 7 hung above the pins in faded black paint, ordinary and patient. Of all the lanes in the building, this was the one Ranger had chosen. Not because of food, not because of an animal, because something beneath it had waited longer than Ethan had been lost. Ranger stepped closer and pressed his shoulder against Ethan's arm. The weight was familiar, grounding, a reminder not to run just because a door had opened. Ethan let out a slow breath, one he had not realized he was holding. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, under Lane 7, the past remained sealed, cold, and deliberate. Ethan slept in the truck that night, not because there were no rooms for rent in Cedar Hollow, but because the truck had rules he understood. Driver's seat back 3 clicks. Window cracked half an inch. Ranger stretched across the passenger side with his head facing the door, keys in the cup holder, boots still on. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the parking lot glazed in silver beneath a low Ohio sky. When Ethan opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Whitaker Lanes through the windshield, its dead sign leaning against the morning like an old man pretending he did not need help. For a moment he considered leaving. He could drive east, lose $10, forget the cold rectangle under Lane 7, and let Cedar Hollow keep its secrets. Ranger lifted his head before Ethan moved. The dog did not bark. He only looked at the building, then at Ethan, with the calm disappointment of someone who already knew the answer. "Yeah," Ethan muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know." By 7, he had found a broom in the storage room and started pushing broken glass into small, careful piles. Work made the space less haunted. Not better, exactly, but less accusing. He cleared the entryway first, then the rental counter, then a path toward the lanes. Dust rose around him in pale clouds. Ranger stayed near the front door, lying where the weak morning light touched his paws, watching the street with the patience of a sentry. Ethan had just lifted a waterlogged cardboard box from behind the shoe rack when tires crunched over the gravel outside. He stopped. Old habits moved through him quietly. Not panic, just inventory. One vehicle light engine, no hurry. Ranger stood ears forward, but his tail gave a single slow sweep. That told Ethan more than the window did. The front door opened with a sticky pull, and a woman stepped inside, carrying a paper bag and 2 coffees in a cardboard tray. She was in her early 60s, maybe older, with gray hair twisted under a red knit cap and a face built from weather kindness, and the kind of fatigue that came from opening a diner before sunrise for 40 years. She looked around the bowling alley, but not like someone inspecting damage. More like someone entering a room where a song had once been playing. "You Ethan Walker?" she asked. "Yes, Mom, Louise Harper. I own the diner." She held up the bag. "You paid for coffee yesterday with exact change and left 2 quarters under the mug." A man counting quarters usually forgets breakfast. Ethan did not know what to do with that, so he took the safer path. "I appreciate it, but I can pay you." "Didn't say you couldn't." She set the tray on the counter, then placed the bag beside it. "I said you forgot breakfast." Ranger walked to her, sniffed once, and sat. Louise looked down at him. "And you must be the reason he bought this place." Ethan almost smiled, almost. He had an opinion. Dogs usually do. People just don't listen soon enough. She peeled the lid off 1 coffee and handed it to Ethan. No soft voice, no careful pity. No questions about where he had slept or why his clothes were wrinkled from the truck seat. That was why he accepted it. The sandwich was egg and cheese on toast, wrapped in foil, still warm. He ate standing up because sitting felt too intimate. Louise walked slowly along the concourse, fingertips hovering above the backs of chairs without touching them. "My husband bowled league here every Thursday for 27 years, she said. "Never good. Always hopeful. There's a difference." Her eyes settled on Lane 5. "Arthur Whitaker used to keep the place open late if somebody needed company more than they needed bowling." Ethan glanced toward Lane 7. "You knew him?" Everybody knew Arthur. Not everybody understood him. She turned back. And Maggie, his wife, she knew every person's name. Not just the regulars, delivery drivers, roofers, the man who came twice a year to service the soda machine. She'd remember how you took your coffee and whether your mother had surgery last spring. Made people stand a little straighter, being remembered like that. Ethan looked down at his cup. He could not remember the last time a stranger had said his name without reading it from a form. Ranger left Louise's side and padded to Lane 7. He stopped there, exactly where he had stopped the night before. Louise saw it. The warmth went out of her face, not completely, but enough. Ethan noticed. He always noticed the half-second before people decided what not to say. "What's special about Lane 7?" he asked. Louise folded her hands around her coffee. Outside, a pickup rolled past without slowing. Inside, the building seemed to hold still. "Arthur called it the Promised Lane," she said. "Why?" Louise looked at Ranger, then at Ethan. "That's not my story to tell." She walked back toward the door, leaving the second coffee on the counter. Find Ray Donnelly, old mechanic. White house on Maple Street with the blue mailbox. If there's something wrong under that lane, Ray will know where to start. At the doorway, she paused and looked once more around Whitaker Lanes. This town forgot this place because forgetting was easier than missing it. Then she stepped into the morning and was gone. Ethan stood with the warm coffee in his hand, Ranger waiting beside Lane 7, and for the first time since buying the building, he understood the thing beneath the floor might not be the only thing buried here. Ray Donnelly lived in a white house on Maple Street with a blue mailbox, exactly where Louise said he would. Though the mailbox leaned so badly, it looked like it was trying to listen to the road. Ethan found him in the side garage just after noon, sitting beside a workbench covered in wrenches, coffee cans full of screws, and 3 clocks that had stopped at 3 different hours. Ray was 68, thin through the shoulders, with silver hair combed straight back and hands that looked permanently shaped around tools. He opened the garage door halfway and stared at Ethan, then at Ranger, then at the old Whitaker Lanes key in Ethan's palm. "Louise sent you," Ray said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." Ray looked past him toward the street, as if checking whether the past had followed. Lane 7, Ethan felt the back of his neck tighten. "How did you know?" Ray gave a dry little laugh that held no humor. "Because nobody comes asking about Whitaker Lanes unless the building finally started talking." He brought a canvas tool bag, a pry bar, a hammer, a drill, 2 flashlights, and an old knee pad he claimed was older than Ethan. Ranger rode in the truck bed for the short drive back, nose lifted into the wind, calm as Sunday. At the bowling alley, Ray stood just inside the entrance for a long time. He took off his cap. Ethan did not ask why. Some places asked for silence before they allowed work to begin. "Arthur kept this floor cleaner than a church plate," Ray said finally. "Had rules about it. No muddy boots on the approach, no coffee past the foul line. No one touched Lane 7 unless Maggie said so." He walked to the lane with the heavy caution of a man stepping into memory. Ranger was already there. The dog sat at the edge of the warped boards, eyes fixed on the rectangle beneath. Ray crouched slowly, his knees cracking. "Well," he whispered, "I'll be." They worked for nearly 3 hours. Not fast, not recklessly. Ethan pried back the damaged maple strips while Ray labeled each piece with painter's tape, muttering that if a man was going to disturb old wood, he could at least do it with manners. Beneath the lane, the concrete patch came into view fully, 4 feet by 3, smooth and deliberate. Ray brushed dust from the edges with his sleeve. "This wasn't county work," he said. "This was Arthur." Ethan drilled the first hole. Gray powder lifted in the beam of the flashlight. The sound echoed through the dead building, too loud at first, then strangely rhythmic, like the place had accepted the work. Ranger lay nearby, chin on his paws, not sleeping, watching. When the final section cracked loose, Ray and Ethan lifted it together, revealing a dark square cavity below. Inside sat a small steel safe wrapped in plastic sheeting, the kind of old fireproof box a man might keep under a bed if he trusted beds more than banks. Ethan reached down and touched it. The metal was cold enough to sting. Ray exhaled through his nose. "Arthur, what did you do?" The safe was not locked. Or maybe it had been once before time and damp air softened the mechanism. Ray worked it with a flathead screwdriver and a patient hand until the latch gave with a dull click. Neither man spoke. Ethan opened the lid. Inside was a canvas bank bag, stiff with age, a sealed metal tube, and a photograph protected in wax paper. Ethan lifted the photo first. A younger Arthur Whitaker stood in front of the bowling alley beside a woman with dark hair pinned back, and a smile so bright it seemed to light the dead. Room from the paper. On the back, in blue ink, Arthur and Maggie opening night, 1978. Ray swallowed. That was her favorite dress. Ethan set the photograph aside carefully and opened the canvas bag. Bundles of cash lay inside, wrapped in paper bands browned at the edges. 20s, 50s, hundreds. Ray counted with the grim precision of a man who did not want imagination involved. 80,000, he said at last. The number did not fill the room the way Ethan expected. It sat there quietly, heavy and almost ashamed. $80,000. Enough to fix his truck, rent a real place, sleep under a roof that did not smell like engine oil. Enough to become invisible again, but with better shoes. Ranger rose then and stepped closer, sniffing not the cash but the metal tube. Ethan picked it up. It had been sealed at both ends, soldered carefully. Ray turned it in his hands beneath the light. then reached into his bag for a small cutting tool. Might be papers, he said. Might be nothing. It was not nothing. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 10 small gold bars and a folded appraisal sheet from 1998. Ray read the value twice before saying it aloud. About 70,000 back then. More now, maybe, but call it 70 if we're keeping our heads. Ethan sat on the edge of lane 7, dust on his jeans, concrete grit in the lines of his palms. $150,000 had weighted under his hand. Ranger leaned against his knee. Ray looked at the photograph again, then toward the dead snack bar, the dark scoring screens, the place where laughter had once moved like warm air. "This isn't treasure," Ethan said quietly. Ray nodded, eyes wet but steady. "No. It's a question." Ethan looked down at the money, then at Maggie Whitaker's young face in the photograph. "Then we'd better find out who's supposed to answer it." The Briar Glen residence sat 30 miles east of Cedar Hollow, behind a row of trimmed hedges and a sign painted in colors too cheerful for the people who parked there with flowers and guilty faces. Ethan noticed things without meaning to. The automatic doors, the polished floor, the faint smell of lemon cleaner trying hard to cover boiled vegetables and medicine. A television murmured in a lounge where 3 people sat facing it without watching. Ranger walked close to Ethan's left knee, calm but alert, his nails clicking softly against the tile. At the front desk, a young receptionist asked who he was visiting. Ethan gave Maggie Whitaker's name and felt Ray shift beside him, hat turning slowly in his hands. "Family?" the receptionist asked. "No, Mom." Then, because it felt more honest, he added, "Not yet." Maggie Whitaker lived in room 214, at the end of a hallway lined with framed prints of covered bridges and autumn barns. Her door was open. She sat beside the window in a pale blue cardigan, thin but upright, silver hair pinned carefully at the back of her head. A book lay open in her lap, though her finger rested halfway down the same page, as if she had been reading one sentence for a long time. She looked up before Ethan knocked. Her eyes were clear gray, sharper than her small room suggested. "Raymond Donnelly," she said. Ray smiled the way men smile when they are trying not to become young again. "Hello, Maggie." Her gaze moved to Ethan, then to Ranger. The dog stopped at the threshold and waited. Maggie noticed. "Well," she said, "at least one of you has manners." Ethan almost apologized, then realized she was smiling. "Mrs. Whitaker, my name is Ethan Walker. I bought Whitaker Lanes at the county sale." He expected surprise, maybe sadness. Instead, Maggie looked past him, through him, towards some version of the building, only she could still see. Did the roof finally give up? Not completely. That roof always had a flair for drama. Ranger stepped inside only after she patted the side of her chair. He lowered his head beneath her hand, and something in Maggie's face loosened, not into weakness, but into memory. Her fingers moved through his fur slowly. "Arthur trusted dogs," she said. "Said they could hear the truth before people admitted it." Ethan sat in the visitor chair. Ray remained standing by the dresser. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside the window, a maintenance man pushed a cart of folded sheets along the sidewalk, and Ethan found himself thinking how strange it was that whole lives could shrink into rooms where strangers changed the linens on schedule. He took the photograph from the folder and placed it gently on her lap. Maggie stared at it. Her hand stopped moving on Ranger's head. "Opening night," she whispered. 1978. "We found it under lane 7, Ethan said. The air changed. Maggie did not look up lane 7. Her voice made the words smaller, softer, almost private. "That was where I got my first strike. I was awful before that. Arthur said I threw the ball like I was asking it not to hurt anyone's feelings." Ray chuckled under his breath. Maggie's smile flickered and faded. "After the strike, he told me that Lane would take care of me someday. I thought he meant he would." Men say things like that when they are happy and scared of how much they love you. Ethan opened the bank bag enough for her to see the paper bands. He did not push it toward her like a prize. There was money too, 80,000, and gold in a tube. Around 70, Maggie stared at the bag, then turned back to the window. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with Winters, bills, locked doors, pawned jewelry, the slow humiliation of needing help from people who remembered when you used to give it. "After Arthur died," she said, "I sold the house first, then the Buick, then his watch. People kept telling me I was lucky to have memories." She gave a small, dry laugh. "Memories don't pay property tax." Ethan looked down. Ranger had rested his chin on Maggie's knee as if anchoring her to the room. "Mrs. Whitaker," Ethan said quietly, "I'm sorry." She turned to him then, and her expression was not anger. That almost made it worse. "Don't spend that apology too easily, Mr. Walker. You didn't bury it." He nodded, accepting the correction. She studied him a moment longer. "But you brought it to me. That matters." Ray wiped at one eye with his thumb and pretended to adjust his glasses. Maggie laid the photograph flat with both hands, smoothing an old crease across Arthur's suit. "He was a good man," she said, "and a foolish one. Sometimes those two things live in the same house." Ethan thought about the truck, about his own silences, about all the people he had tried to protect by keeping them outside the locked rooms in him. Maggie looked at Ranger again. "What's his name, Ranger?" "Of course it is." She gave the dog's ear a gentle scratch. "Well, Ranger found what Arthur hid. Now you men have to decide whether you're brave enough to tell the rest of the truth." Ethan drove back to Whitaker Lanes with the photograph on the seat between him and Ranger, though he had already returned the money and gold to a lockbox at Ray's place until they could speak with an attorney. It was the kind of practical choice people made when they were afraid of doing the wrong thing by accident. Dusk had settled over Cedar Hollow by the time he reached Route 22. The bowling alley looked different after Maggie's room, not newer, not better, but more alive in its damage. The sagging roof was no longer just a repair bill. The cracked windows were not just broken glass. Every stain seemed attached to somebody's ordinary happiness. Coffee cooling beside scorecards, league jackets over chairbacks, Maggie laughing behind the counter while Arthur pretended not to watch her. Ethan unlocked the door and let Ranger in first. The dog did not go to lane 7 this time. He crossed the concourse past the rental shoes and stopped near the old snack bar. Ethan followed, tired enough to feel hollow behind the ribs. "Not tonight," he said softly. Ranger looked back once. Not pleading, not pushing, just waiting. Ethan set his flashlight on the counter. The snack bar was narrow, with red vinyl stools split along the seams and a glass pie case filmed gray from years of dust. Behind it stood a dead refrigerator, an old soda machine, and shelves lined with paper cups that had turned brittle with age. The menu above the grill still listed Maggie's Friday Night Chili in careful block letters. Ethan touched the sign without meaning to. It was strange how a person could be absent and still leave instructions for warmth. Ranger put his nose to the base of the refrigerator. It was too heavy for one man, but Ethan had moved heavier things by thinking slowly. He found a dolly in the utility room, rocked the fridge forward inch by inch, and slid it away from the wall. Beneath it, partly hidden by grease-darkened dust, was a square cut into the concrete. Unlike the patch under lane 7, this one had a small iron ring set flat into the surface. Ethan crouched and brushed it clean. His pulse did not race. That surprised him. Some discoveries arrive like thunder. This one arrived like a sentence finally finishing itself. He hooked 2 fingers through the ring and pulled. Nothing. The seal held. He got Ray's pry bar from the truck and worked it along the edge until the square lifted with a soft scrape. Underneath sat a tin box wrapped in oilcloth, no lock, no label, just time. Ranger lay down beside him, his head between his paws, eyes fixed on Ethan's hands. Inside the box were stacks of cash, more than Ethan had ever seen outside a bank counter. The bills were banded and flat, preserved with the care of a man who had thought waiting would be temporary. Beneath them lay a cream-colored envelope, yellowed at the edges. On the front, in ink faded brown, were 6 words. "Maggie, if this finds you late." Ethan stopped reading there. His thumb rested on the flap. The room seemed to lean closer. He could open it. No one would know. Maybe the letter explained everything. Maybe it named debts, mistakes, instructions, forgiveness. Maybe it would help him decide what to do. He thought of all the sealed places in his own life, the things he had called protection because fear sounded weaker. He thought of Nora's ring beside the coffee maker, of every question he had answered with silence, until silence became the only language left. Ranger lifted his head and placed one paw on Ethan's wrist. Not hard, just enough. Ethan let go of the envelope. "You're right," he whispered. "It's hers." He counted the money only because responsibility required numbers. $200,000. Rounded by intention, bundled in a way that made hiding look almost respectable. Then he put everything back exactly as he had found it, except the envelope, which he slipped into a clean folder from his glove box. The next morning, he returned to Briar Glen before breakfast. Maggie was seated by the window with Ranger already pressing his head into her palm as if they had known each other for years. Ethan handed her the folder. "We found another box," he said. "There's money in it, a lot, but this was on top." Maggie looked at the handwriting and closed her eyes. For a moment, age fell away from her face and left only the young woman from the photograph, standing on opening night beside a man who loved her badly and completely. She opened the envelope with careful fonts. Ethan turned toward the window, giving her the privacy Arthur had failed to give. Her voice, when she finally read aloud, was thin but steady. "Keeping fear from you was not protection. It was loneliness with a lock on it." Ethan swallowed. Ranger stayed still beneath her hand. Maggie read the rest silently. When she finished, she pressed the letter against her chest, not as if it healed everything, but as if it had returned one missing piece of the truth. "He thought he was saving me from worry," she said. "All he did was leave me alone with questions." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Maggie looked at him then, not gently but honestly. "Remember that, Mr. Walker. A person cannot be respected in the dark." By Friday morning, the money had a number, a folder, and 3 signatures. Ray knew a retired attorney named Helen Mercer who still kept an office above the pharmacy, mostly because she disliked gardening and trusted no one else in Cedar Hollow to sort old deeds correctly. She spread the papers across her desk while Ethan stood by the window and Ranger slept beneath the chair, one paw touching Ethan's boot as if the dog had decided legal matters also required supervision. Helen explained things plainly. Because Ethan had purchased the property through a tax lien sale, because the contents had been concealed inside the structure, because there were no active claims filed against Arthur Whitaker's estate, the law might allow Ethan to keep a large portion, perhaps all of it after notice and proper filings. She did not say this with greed or judgment. She said it the way weather reports say rain is coming. Ethan listened, hands folded behind his back. $350,000. He tried to imagine it as his, a roof that did not leak, a bed he chose instead of a truck seat he endured, tires for the Ford, dental work he had postponed twice, enough quiet to stop counting every cup of coffee, enough distance to disappear properly. The thought should have felt like relief. Instead, it sat in him like a stone. Maggie sat across from Helen, Arthur's letter in her purse, her hands resting on top of it as if the paper still had a pulse. She had dressed carefully for the meeting, navy blouse, pearl earrings, lipstick just bright enough to remind the room she was not finished being seen. When Helen asked what she wanted, Maggie looked at Ethan first. Not because she needed permission, because she wanted him to witness the answer. "I want the truth handled decently," she said, "and I want no one pretending Arthur was wiser than he was." Ray gave a soft cough that might have been a laugh. Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog opened one eye. That was the whole problem with Ranger. He never told Ethan what to do. He simply made it harder to lie to himself. By afternoon, they were back at Whitaker Lanes. Sunlight fell through the front windows and laid pale rectangles across the dusty carpet. The money was locked away for the moment, but Ethan could still feel its weight in the building. Not as cash, but as choice. He walked to Lane 7 and sat on the edge, where the boards had been lifted. Ranger followed, circled once, and settled beside him. "I could use it," Ethan said. His voice sounded small in the open room. Ranger rested his chin on his paws. "That's not the same as it being mine." The words came out before Ethan fully understood them. He thought of every person who had ever looked at him and seen only a uniform, a diagnosis, a "thank you for your service" moment they could walk away from feeling generous. He thought of Maggie in room 214, reduced by strangers to an elderly woman with a meal schedule, when she had once been the heartbeat of a room full of names. He thought of Arthur, who had mistaken secrecy for strength and left love locked in concrete. Respect, Ethan realized, was not soft. It was not a compliment or a casserole or a hand on the shoulder. Respect was letting people stand inside the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. That evening, Ethan placed 3 handwritten notes on the snack bar and read them aloud to Ranger, because someone needed to hear them first. The first created a care account for Maggie, $120,000. Not charity, not repayment exactly, but recognition. Years had been taken from her by silence. The money could not return them, but it could give her choices no one else had bothered to ask about. The second set aside $100,000 for Whitaker Lanes. Roof repair, wiring, plumbing, permits. The machines Ray said were stubborn but not dead. The third was the one that made Ethan's throat tighten. The Whitaker Respect Fund. Not a grand foundation. Not a plaque with rich names on it. A small local fund for people who needed one practical thing before life tipped too far. Glasses, work boots, a car repair, a utility bill, a week in a clean motel room, a ride to an appointment. Help given without spectacle. Help that did not make a person smaller for needing it. Ethan kept enough to fix his truck, buy groceries, and rent the small office behind the lanes until it could become a proper room. When he finished reading, Ranger rose, walked to the truck, and returned dragging Ethan's old wool blanket by one corner. The dog dropped it behind the counter, beside the broken stool and the dead coffee maker, then looked up at him. Ethan stared at the blanket, then laughed once, quietly, because if he did not laugh, he might break open in some other way. "We live here now?" Ranger's tail moved slowly across the dust. Ethan bent down and pressed his forehead to the dog's. For the first time in years, the future did not look like escape. It looked like work. It looked like names remembered. It looked like a door left unlocked during daylight, because someone might need to come in. Graham Pierce arrived on a Tuesday morning in a black Lincoln Navigator, polished so clean it reflected the ruined sign of Whitaker Lanes like an accusation. Ethan saw him from the roof, where he was helping Ray measure the worst of the leaks. Ranger saw him first. The dog stood at the edge of the gravel lot, still as a statue, not growling, not baring teeth, simply watching the way he watched storms before they broke. Graham stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat, leather gloves, and shoes too expensive for a parking lot that had more weeds than asphalt. He looked at the building without affection. Men like him did not see rot and remember laughter. They saw square footage, access roads, zoning maps, projected revenue. "Ethan Walker," he called. Ethan climbed down the ladder slowly, wiping tar from his palm with an old rag. "That's right." Graham handed him a business card. "Pierce Urban Development, Columbus, Ohio." The letters were embossed, heavy under Ethan's thumb. "I'll be direct," Graham said. "You bought a liability. I'm prepared to take it off your hands." Ethan looked past him at the bowling alley. A week ago, he might have heard the offer differently. Today, he heard Louise's voice in the snack bar, Maggie reading Arthur's letter, Ray muttering over old machines as if they were stubborn friends. "It's not for sale." Graham smiled without warmth. "Everything is for sale. Some people just haven't heard the right number." He offered $20,000 first, then $50,000 by noon. He explained the plan as if kindness were a math problem. A mixed-use complex, pharmacy, coffee chain, upper-floor apartments, parking along the rear, jobs for locals, tax revenue for Cedar Hollow. He did not sound cruel. That made it harder. Cruelty would have been simple. Graham sounded reasonable, and reason, Ethan had learned, could sometimes erase a thing more thoroughly than hatred ever could. "This place has been closed for 22 years, Graham said, glancing at the dead sign. "Nobody needs it." Ranger moved then, not toward Graham but toward the front door, where he sat beneath the crooked W in Whitaker. Ethan followed the dog with his eyes. "You're not buying land," he said quietly. "You're asking me to erase people." Graham's expression tightened. "People also need progress." "Progress for who?" Ethan asked. The question hung between them, plain and uncomfortable. By Thursday, Graham's attorney had sent letters questioning the tax sale, the deed, the hidden assets, every loose nail they could name. Helen Mercer answered each one with the calm precision of a woman who had been waiting decades to be underestimated. The deed was valid. The sale was recorded. Arthur Whitaker's old ledgers, found in a metal cabinet behind the office, showed no active lien that could touch Ethan's claim. But inside that same ledger was something Ethan had not expected. Names, dozens of them, small payments, rent covered, medical bills paid, store accounts settled. Always in Arthur's neat block handwriting, always with no public credit. Ray recognized half the names. Louise cried when she saw her husband's first diner loan marked paid in 1991. Then Ethan found one entry dated March 1987. Samuel Pierce, hardware lease, 3 months. Note, keep the lights on. People need places to come back to. Graham returned on Friday with a surveyor. Ethan met him outside and handed him a photocopy of the page. Graham read it once, then again. The color left his face in a quiet, private way. "Samuel Pierce was my father," he said. "I know." Graham looked toward Whitaker Lanes, but for the first time, he seemed to see something other than demolition. His father's store had stayed open through a bad year. His mother had kept the house. He had gone to college from an upstairs room above shelves of nails, paint, and seed packets. All of it, at least in part, because Arthur Whitaker had paid 3 months of rent and asked for nothing back. Graham folded the paper carefully, almost tenderly. He never told me. A lot of men thought silence was dignity, Ethan said. Ranger came to stand beside him, shoulder brushing his leg. Graham did not apologize. Not then. Some truths need time before they can become words. He only looked at the cracked sign, the boarded windows, the tired old doors, and said, "What do you need first?" Ethan studied him. Roofing materials, electrical work, and a promise you won't put your name on anything Arthur paid for. Graham gave a small nod. Fair. The next morning his navigator did not return. A flatbed truck did, loaded with lumber, shingles, wiring, and paint. Graham stepped out in jeans and work boots that still looked too new, but he took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and waited for Ray to tell him where to stand. Whitaker Lanes reopened on the first Saturday of May, not with fireworks or a ribbon wide enough for the newspaper, but with Maggie Whitaker standing beneath the repaired sign in a cream-colored coat, one hand resting on Ranger's head, the other holding a pair of old bowling shoes she had kept for 22 years in the back of her closet. The red letters above her glowed again, not perfectly. One still flickered when the wind shifted. Ray said he could fix it by Monday. Maggie told him not to hurry. A little flicker reminds people the light had to fight its way back, she said, and no one argued. By noon, the parking lot was full. Louise arrived first with 6 pots of coffee and a tray of cinnamon rolls she claimed were ugly enough to be free. Ray stood near the machines, listening to the pin setters with the anxious tenderness of a doctor, waiting for a heartbeat. Graham Pierce came in quietly through the side door, carrying a toolbox instead of a checkbook. He did not make a speech. He did not need to. For 3 weeks he had shown up in jeans and work gloves, taking orders from Ray, sweeping sawdust, hauling sheetrock, writing checks only when Helen told him where the money could go without putting his name on the walls. That had been Ethan's rule. No saviors, no plaques. No one got to buy forgiveness in letters big enough to read from the road. Inside, the place looked both new and old, which was exactly right. The roof no longer leaked. The carpet had been cleaned but not replaced. The scoring screens worked when they felt like it. 10 lanes shone under soft light, polished enough for play, not so polished that they forgot the shoes that had crossed them. At the far end of Lane 7, a small square of thick glass had been set into the floor where the safe once slept beneath concrete. Under it was emptiness now, lit gently from the side, a visible absence. Beside it hung a framed note in Maggie's handwriting. Some things should never have been hidden. Some things should never be forgotten. Ethan had wanted to put Arthur's name there. Maggie had said no. Let the lesson stand taller than the man, she told him. People came because they were curious, then stayed because someone remembered them. Maggie sat behind the counter for only an hour, doctor's orders. But in that hour she called 12 people by name, asked about a hip replacement, a second marriage, a brother in Akron, and a tomato garden that had once won a county ribbon. Men who had arrived with their hands in their pockets stood straighter when she recognized them. Women touched the counter like it was a church pew. Older league bowlers stood at the approach with rental balls in their hands, laughing softly at knees that no longer bent the way memory promised. No one mocked them. No one rushed them. That was the first rule Ethan had painted above the shoe counter. Every person deserves to be greeted by name. The Whitaker Respect Fund began that same afternoon in a coffee can Louise placed beside the register. By closing time, it held folded bills, 3 checks, a note offering free plumbing labor, and a business card from a dentist in Briar Glen who had written, "Call me for anyone who needs help quietly." Ethan read that line twice. Help quietly. It sounded like Arthur, but cleaner somehow, with the door left open and the person still allowed to choose. Near dusk, Maggie took Lane 7. Ray tried to help her stand, but she waved him off with the kind of pride that had not aged a day. Ranger walked beside her all the way to the approach, matching his pace to hers without being told. Ethan handed her a blue 8-pound ball they had found in storage and polished until it shone like a small moon. The room quieted. Maggie looked down the lane, shoulders squared, eyes bright. "If this goes in the gutter," she said, "I expect no witnesses." Louise snorted. Graham smiled. Ethan felt something loosen in the room. Something that had been holding its breath since 2004. Maggie rolled the ball. It moved slowly, almost politely, drifting left, correcting right, touching the wood with a whisper instead of a roar. One pin fell, then another. Then 6 more in a clattering sweep that made the whole building gasp before laughter broke open everywhere. Not a strike. Not even close, better than that. Proof that the lane still answered. Later, after the last car left and Louise locked the diner across the street, Ethan sat on the roof with Ranger beside him. Below, Whitaker Lanes glowed through clean windows. Maggie's small apartment behind the office had one lamp on. Ray's truck was still parked crooked near the service entrance. Graham had forgotten his gloves on the counter. Ethan looked at the sign, the parking lot, the town beyond it, and felt no urge to drive away. Home, he realized, was not the building he had bought for $10. Home was the place Ranger had refused to leave, the place where hidden things were brought into the light, and people were allowed to stand inside their own names again. If this story touched you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me which moment stayed with you the most. And before you go, where are you watching from tonight?